Halloween's approach, I wanted to offer a novel explanation for what ails medicine by signposting it through Halloween costumes. My argument is that we have lost our common faith that physicians can be, like Sir William Osler before us, a certain kind of hero. The words he used to describe the labor of physicians, words like calling and nobility, have come to seem like childish ways that we have set aside. I want to explore how it happened, how it turned physicians into zombies, and I'd like to offer an alternative that physicians can be vampires instead of heroes and seek humility and nobility. First, as an academic physician, I need to give you my conflicts of interest. These are they. Probably the most important is that a portion of this appears in my book, Progress Notes, which this book is actually a narrative story of 7 students. It's written for people, a lay audience, about what it means to become a physician today, and follows 7 medical students as they seek their match. But I wanted to draw out some of the intellectual argument that kind of underlies the story, and I'm hoping to do so today. I finished the book, and the book came out a little later than I wanted to because there was this big life-altering event that occurred in the middle of it. It was called a pandemic. And these med students in the book graduated the year of the pandemic. And so in talking about today, I wanted to reflect a little bit about the pandemic. When the COVID pandemic began, I was giving a talk like this. It was the last in-person talk I would give for 18 months. And as we left the lecture hall, a content creator wanted to add something to a social media feed, and he asked me this phrase: "What does it mean to socially distance?" And I did not know how to respond. I didn't know at the time where the phrase came from. I didn't know that sociologists had a scale for it, asking what kind of social relationship you would accept with people of different backgrounds. But I soon learned, like we all did, that the phrase could become an imperative prescription. Maintain social distance. Apart is the only way out. In those first months of the pandemic, social distancing seemed egalitarian because it applied to everyone. But then we learned quickly that social distancing could be exclusionary. If you owned your own dwelling and could work online, it was comparatively easy to stay 6 feet apart. The professional class could often work remotely, but essential workers like first responders, grocers, nurses, postal workers could not work from home. Many of my patients who were institutionalized, prisoners, homeless, could neither work nor be at home. Physicians fascinatingly straddled the professional and essential divide. Our work, like custodians, was in person. My wife and I are both physicians. It was a med school romance, and we bicycled each morning on empty streets to our respective hospitals, which regained a neglected urgency. Beds were filled. Toilet paper went missing from staff bathrooms. Personal protective equipment was rinsed and reused, and we wore handmade masks. At night, we heard the communal wolf calls that carried out over the city. We saw signs of support for essential workers and felt more encouraged than exhausted when the side of my hospital was spray painted with the word heroes. We watched fireworks celebrating masked heroes. We listened as the world borrowed bravery. We debated the call and the danger of duty. And we initially felt more fully than ever like physicians. That early part of the pandemic was hero time. Around Denver, plywood sheets covering closed restaurants became canvases for murals of masked clinicians like this one. Arms crossed over green scrubs, hands sheathed in sparring gloves. Shuttered restaurants cooked down refrigerators, delivering baked goods and coffee to clinical workrooms just behind what people called the front lines. All of this was encouraging to doctors as they cared for patients lingering for months on ventilators, their families forbidden to visit. When patients recovered enough for discharge, the hospital would play a celebratory Beatles song over the hospital intercom. Then the copyright holder threatened a lawsuit, so we settled on a chime. When patients succumbed, the patients silently added names to their unfurling list of victims. Life had a sound, but death was silent. In those first parts of the pandemic, we said that everyone was doing our part. Then we realized that only some were coming apart. Our city and a hospital, like most across the country and the world, gradually moved from alliance, the sense that we're all in this together, to anxiety. Who will survive this? To anger. Why are some surviving this differently? And finally, to anguish. Why are we losing so much? The weaknesses in every system we had, agricultural, biological, economic, environmental, legislative, political, were exploited by only one of the 39 known species of coronaviruses. If you go back and look before the pandemic, the United States was rated as the most pandemic-ready country in the world. But when the pandemic arrived, the United States experienced 20% of the world's COVID fatalities, despite having only 4% of the world's population. We had invested in high-tech medicine, but it was low-tech measures dependent upon solidarity that we needed. We found those in odd places. A family physician I know received a call from one of his patients during Easter week. Homebound by an anxiety disorder, the patient had followed the earliest news reports about the SARS-CoV-2 and worried 2 months before everyone else that it would unleash a pandemic. In the weeks after Christmas, he started stockpiling N95 masks. By the time his shipments arrived to his house, he had enough masks to assuage his anxiety and a surplus to share. So he called his family physician and he offered a donation. The physician said, "What strings attached to this?" And the man said, "No strings at all. I want no human contact." So if you look in this picture, you can see on Easter morning, 2 physicians standing on a sidewalk outside of an open window of a 6th-floor condo in Denver, catching falling garbage bags filled with personal protective equipment. The very next day, the masks covered the faces of healthcare workers. Barely a month into the pandemic, it was clear that a microscopic virus was humbling a superpower's medicine so much that they were begging the sky for supplies on Easter morning. It was also clear that thinking of ourselves as healthcare heroes would not be enough. Why? What do heroes do? They save the day. And thinking about physicians as heroes works for a bit when you think that the pandemic would follow the projected curve of a tragedy. Something like this, that you could see that would be posted online or in the CDC reports, in newspapers. That this idea that we would have this moment when there'd be this heroic moment, and then we'd have a honeymoon, community cohesion, some disillusionment, but quickly, about a year afterwards, only up to 1 year, we would enter recovery. But when the recovery is ever delayed, which I would argue has been, you realize you don't need heroes to save the day, because day adds up to weeks and months and years. You don't need superheroes for that work. I believe you need vampires. And that's what I'd like to argue is the future of medicine. Allow me to explain. I borrow this concept of physicians as vampires from this remarkable book by the philosopher L.A. Paul. This is a picture of her here. And she says, sometimes you'll face an experience that will fundamentally change you in unknown ways. You know you'll be a different person on the other side, but you can't know how different. The only way through is to make the choice. And you think the decision can be a rational choice. Gather information, weigh options, select the option that best fits you. Paul says that that works for many choices, but not when you are choosing to be transformed. She calls these kinds of activities transformative experiences. She says they're intense, they're overwhelming, and life-changing experiences which affect you in ways you can never fully predict. She gives several examples. She says, imagine that you were born deaf and you choose to receive a cochlear implant.
About to die for an iPhone.
You imagine that you choose to get married. You have a first child, and she says, imagine that you become a vampire. She says, each of these are transformative experiences if you choose to become the undead. If you read Paul, she picks only one profession as a similar kind of life-changing experience. She writes, becoming a doctor requires a high level of commitment, focus, and planning, not to mention luck and hard work. Medical school and residency are grueling experiences that require you to set aside other pursuits and focus almost entirely on your training and performance, end quote. Only doctoring, in her account, is like becoming a parent or a vampire. And it got me thinking, parents, vampires, and physicians. All of them are transformed in the middle of the night. It is at night that some of them soothe some of the crying, others bleed others dry, and others mend the ones they can. Now, aspirants to the House of Medicine have chosen these kinds of transformative experiences for generations. You spend a decade or more, typically the peak years of your own physical health, in lecture halls and laboratories, operating rooms and hospital wards, learning to care for the sick. You risk your life by drawing close to the ill. Hippocrates famously counseled, "For the physician sees terrible sights, touches unpleasant things, and the misfortunes of others bring a harvest of sorrows that are particularly his. But the sick, by means of the art, rid themselves of the worst of evils, disease, suffering, pain, and death." That's the deal. But the pandemics have a way of changing the odds and altering the deal, of changing the transformative experience. Who knows? It's probably different to be a vampire in a pandemic. It's certainly different being a physician. Remember the hero healthcare worker I showed you in that mural on the side of a Denver restaurant? It has wings. Why wings? I think it's in part because of this picture from 1896 by Max Brodel. It's of a physician so important that he was knighted, and he's known as Sir William Osler. This famous drawing from his lifetime depicts a mustachioed, balding Osler as a cherub in a garment that amalgamates a physician's white coat and the robe of a singer in the heavenly choir as he rides a purifying whirlwind into the cloud above the Johns Hopkins Hospital, where he worked and taught. Osler is held aloft by angel wings sprouting from his scapulae. The drawing was entitled "The Saint." A halo glows above Osler's head as he gazes determinedly into the future. On the ground below him, infectious diseases flee. The image was misleading. Osler never made any basic science breakthroughs or clinical advances against disease, infectious or otherwise. What Osler did was create the social structures of a physician's life and narrated them as a rigorous, self-sacrificing professionalism. Osler called our work a noble calling, like the work of a knight, like a hero. Now, to understand why this has set us up for some problems, we need to make a brief detour and get super nerdy and talk about the sociologist Max Weber. In his famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber, I believe, implicitly describes physician culture when he describes the Protestant work ethic which built capitalism, because I believe it is that culture that also shaped Osler and ultimately the practice of every physician today. Weber says that Puritans were enjoined to methodically and doggedly pursue their vocation, to take rational risks, develop innovative practices, and increase productivity. As they worked, believers were required to conduct themselves ascetically and set aside, as Weber said, the spontaneous enjoyment of life. No seeking after pleasure, no spontaneous impulses, none of the unscheduled time off that the current generation of trainees is asking for. Believers disciplined themselves to use time to pursue rational goods. Sport was not play, but a means to increase physical efficiency for the sake of work. School was not curiosity, but a way to increase work productivity. What Weber wrote about Puritans describes the culture of contemporary physicians: work constantly, increase productivity, seek innovation, and defer pleasure unless it can increase your work capacity. That's why I say the Venn diagram for the personality types of physicians and ultramarathoners overlaps, especially here in Colorado. To be sure, a physician should exercise, meditate, and sleep, but to increase the productivity of your labor, right? That's how we describe the benefit of these things, is you engage in these activities so they'll make you a better laborer. Now, a physician can, and often should, in Weber's language, skip traditional practices and familial obligations when work calls. When Weber wrote about the Puritan way of life, forming the blueprint for modern economic life, I believe he's implicitly describing how medicine became a rationalized version of charity. Care for the sick became not a personal encounter, but an exchange that secured a stable financial life. A century ago, Weber understood the trouble that ensued. Rationalizing the Puritan version of a calling enabled the development of capitalism, which then repaid the favor by devaluing the meaning of your calling into what Weber called a caput mortem, a worthless remains, a zombie version of a vocation. Today, if you read Weber and accept that argument, you can see that a physician works like a believer, but without any of the old beliefs. And their world becomes, in Weber's resounding world, disenchanted. So there's this debate in the literature about what to describe about what's wrong with medicine. Is it burnout? Is it moral injury? Right? Is it anxiety, depression, a mental health crisis? I believe it is disenchantment. Now, in German, it sounds frightening. Die Einsberger der Welt. And in English, it sounds clinical. My German is horrible. I appreciate somebody smiling and laughing at my bad German. Even though my name's Nussbaum, which is German, I speak none. In English, it sounds clinical, the disenchantment of the world. In either language, I believe Weber described where most physicians now stand. Physicians work like Puritans, but unlike Puritans, they no longer believe. Medicine has become ever more profitable because physicians work like true believers, but the profit undermines what physicians truly believe in. Let me give you an example of that. In the book, I had reason to look up what physicians got paid at different times. And in the book, I found a set of tables for what a physician made at Johns Hopkins Hospital at various eras. And then I was able to go look up salaries of teachers in the Baltimore School District. And I found that, for example, in the 1950s, a Johns Hopkins radiologist and a Baltimore County school teacher were making the same amount of money, right? Imagine what kind of a world that is when somebody's choosing a job and they're choosing this life, but they know that the remuneration is roughly the same as a teacher. Now, public school teachers' salaries have not in any way kept up with inflation, but it gives you a small taste of what's happened to the physician life. So, no longer seeking salvation through their work, physicians cannot remember what made the work enchanting in the first place. Some call physicians burned out. I believe we are disenchanted. If you read Weber, the irony is that the Calvinist version of calling first rationalized the Christian version of what it means to have a vocation, and then tragically devalued its own doctrines. In the earnest pursuit of a calling, a believer initially favored rational doctrine over irrational faith, but eventually comes to favor rationality itself. Once rationalized, modern economic life regarded ascetic Protestantism as a set of obsolete traditional practices, which were themselves obstacles to the capitalist calling. Weber wrote, "Victorious capitalism has no further need now for this support, now that it rests on the foundation of the machine. Even the optimistic mood of its laughing air, the Enlightenment, seems destined to fade away, and the idea of duty and a calling haunts our lives like the ghosts of once held religious beliefs." Physicians are only now awakening to this reality. Perhaps it is because our most influential theorist of the contemporary physician's vocation remains William Osler, who simultaneously transformed the labor of physicians and rewrote the meaning of their labor. Osler is celebrated as the father of contemporary medical training because he was a founding physician of the medical school at Hopkins, the first truly contemporary medical school. He required undergraduate degrees before entering medical school, a rigorously scientific education during medical school, and clinical years in the medical school's affiliated teaching hospital. He developed the teaching service, in which a medical student, intern, junior resident, chief resident, and fellow walked the wards with an attending physician. To populate these teaching services, Osler developed the very first residency for medical school graduates. So the way that I was educated, the way my wife was educated, but also the way my son, who's a pre-med, right, is being educated, all was designed ultimately by William Osler. The renown of Osler's model received institutional support from a Carnegie-founded commission study of American medical schools, which hailed Johns Hopkins as, quote, practically ideal and the future of medical education. Soon after the report, medical schools either closed their doors or retailored themselves to fit the meritocratic Oslerian model. Osler was the paradigmatic physician for the physicians he taught directly, and those like me he taught indirectly. So when I was in med school, right, when we would go to lecture hall, we would hear quotes from Osler from the faculty, and we needed to take a break. Our medical school cafe was literally called the Osler Cafe. Here in Colorado, where Osler never visited, the basement conference room of our biggest conference room of our hospital is called the Osler Hall, right? Why is Osler so famous? right? There is a collection from 1914, which you can look up. You can find a PDF online for free of Osler's works, Equanimitas. And it was a way to describe the ideals of medical practice. For 2 generations, it was distributed to generations of graduating medical students by pharmaceutical manufacturers. It was the one book all physicians got. And if you read Equanimitas today, you find that Osler imbibes the practice of medicine as an art, not a trade, a calling, not a business, a calling in which your heart will be exercised equally with your head. Often the best part of your work will have nothing to do with potions and powders, but with the exercise of an influence of the strong upon the weak, of the righteous upon the wicked, of the wise upon the foolish. What's fascinating about this is that it seems like Osler's telling us medicine's not a business, it's a calling. But if you listen carefully and you've read Max Weber, you can see that he's articulating the kind of calling that Osler says will always be devalued because it is rationalized. And importantly, in this passage, you can see the ways that Osler's using, and I believe misusing, Christian language and allusions to describe the labor of a physician. You can see this throughout Osler's writing. Consider his famous address, Internal Medicine as a Vocation. In it, Osler told an audience of physicians that they could sustain themselves in medicine only if they understood their labor as a vocation. Even at that time, he said, my audience fears the demise of the physician's calling, but Osler reassured them, quote, the opportunities are still great, the harvest is truly plenteous, and the laborers scarcely sufficient to meet the demand. In that passage, Osler glossed Matthew 9:37 to describe the work of physicians. And when Osler described the mission fields for a physician's harvest, he names, quote, the laboratories and clinics of the great European cities, end quote, and the great teaching hospitals of America's growing urban centers. Instead of, say, encouraging aspiring physicians to perform works of mercy, Osler told them to, quote, see autopsies daily, end quote, because it was autopsies which would sharpen diagnostic skills while enabling a physician to, quote, correct his mistakes, and if he reads its lessons aright, it may serve to keep him humble, end quote. If you read Osler, the education of a physician was rational. It occurred in universities, teaching hospitals, laboratories, and the dissection chambers, but also moral. For each of those places was a schoolhouse for a physician's character. As he developed his skill and character, Osler counseled a young physician that he, quote, cannot expect to do more than just eke out a living. He must put his emotions on ice, end quote. In statements like that, you can see that a physician must act like the ascetic Protestants described by Weber, abjuring pleasures, emotions, and luxuries while pursuing their vocation. And Osler even encouraged physicians to build rational knowledge as capital, writing that after 7 years of labor, a physician will, quote, have a very large accumulation of interest-bearing funds in his brain pan, end quote. Osler liked to punctuate his addresses with scriptural allusions. For example, quoting Matthew 22:14 to tell his audience that many are called, but few are chosen. And many of those who start out with high aims, few see the goal, end quote. He compared the aspirations for a seat at the table in the kingdom of heaven, which is what Matthew 22 is about, with building, quote, a good consultation practice. Osler then concluded the essay by quoting Ecclesiastes 4:6, saying, quote, the mournful echo of the words of the preacher ring in their ears, words which I not long ago heard quoted with deep feeling by a distinguished physician. Quote, better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit, end quote. Throughout his writings, Osler quoted aphorisms from Jewish wisdom literature and Christian gospels to describe the labor of physicians. He quoted the King James to explain why physicians should think a case through, gather facts, and skeptically reimagine their assumptions. In doing so, Osler rationalized religious counsel, and it was implemented in Flexner's report, which specifically praised Osler for turning medical students into, quote, practitioners of modern medicine who are alert, systematic, thorough, and critically open-minded, end quote. Now, one of the fascinating historical things to me is that Osler is promulgating his vision of the physician's vocation at the very same time that Max Weber is writing about vocation for the Protestant ethic, and then in his subsequent essays on science as a vocation and politics as a vocation. I can find no evidence that Osler or Weber read each other. But one of the fascinating things is that Osler is effectively completing the work that Weber's describing. If you think about it, as a theorist, Weber's developing a rationalized version of the Calvinist vocation to describe the work of science. But Weber was very aware of the irony that led to disenchantment. But at the same time, Osler, as a medical educator, was articulating a rationalized vision of the labor of physicians, which has been realized in a century's worth of health professional training programs, which privilege the labor of physicians over other workers, and the domination of research universities by their health systems. As a writer, Osler also provided a scriptural language to describe the labor of physicians as a noble calling. I believe that's part of why we've come undone in medicine, is that we no longer can share Osler's scriptural language to describe what we're doing. And I believe that it's in part because in both roles, Osler failed to appreciate the ways in which rationalizing the physician's calling served the interests of capitalism. It is hard to imagine Osler writing, as Weber did in the Protestant Ethic, that, quote, in its early days, capitalism needed workers who were willing to subject themselves to economic exploitation for the sake of their conscience, end quote. But it's easy to imagine reading Osler as completing that same project. When Osler described the realities of a physician's life, he emphasized the benefits of hard labor for revealing the character of a physician. This is his description of a general practitioner. He wrote that his life is hard as exacting, that he's underpaid and overworked, that he has but little time for study and less for recreation. These are the blows that may give fine temper to his steel and bring out the nobler elements in his character. End quote. The labor of an Oslerian physician revealed the nobility of his character rather than his role in either an economic or a religious topography. Whether or not a contemporary physician has read anything other than Osler's aphorisms, Osler's words are the ghosts of once-held beliefs which haunt contemporary physicians. When physicians speak of a calling, we often expect the nobility and privilege that Osler described. Perhaps if physicians read Weber instead, we would have an increased awareness of why our vocations are disenchanted, of why in national surveys of physicians, 6% of American physicians think about suicide each year, half report burnout, half are considering early retirement, and half would counsel a young person against entering medicine. In a medical profession whose expectations are still formed by Osler, it is news that burnout reduces a physician's sense of calling. Weber understood a century ago that you shoulder a rationalized calling alone. With a Weberian appreciation for the irony of the physician's vocation, that in our pursuit of its rationalization, we subsequently devalued our calling, physicians might be more realistic about the practice of medicine. Reading Weber, and this is his approach in Science as a Vocation, we could teach physicians to appreciate the limits of rationality, so physicians could learn to use evidence-based treatment guidelines with individual patients or to mine data from population-level data sets, but also when to use more humane approaches. Reading Weber might teach physicians to abandon romanticized accounts of vocation, so physicians would be more transparent about the financial aspects of a physician's life. After reading Weber, a physician might know their fate, face it directly, and pursue this worldly, value-oriented work without concern for its meaning. This idea is plausible if physicians could complete the work begun by Osler, turning one more crank of the Weberian interpretive box to show physicians not only that our calling is rationalized, but that our embrace of rationality was the first step in the devaluation of our calling. Perhaps. Modern theorists are read as box builders. Boxes can be interpretive machines. They can also be fixed enclosures from which nothing living escapes. They can become, in short, coffins. While the Weberian box explains the disenchantment of the physician's vocation, it also forecloses the possibility of escape. The Weberian box is an immanent box, which disallows the possibility of transcendence. Weber knew the bounds of that box. He wrote that without a transcendent, ultimate authority, we have no grounds to resolve value conflicts. His counsel was simple: accept your fate. There is no solution within Weber to the disenchantment of the world. Weber offered only a modest hedge against nihilism. He recast a calling, a vocation, as a personal struggle against an impersonal modernity. Weber called his audience to pursue science as this kind of vocation while embracing their fate, pursuing labor whose meaning is rational and delimited. Now, could one somehow infuse a physician's labor with meaning through activities like mindfulness, stress management, and communication skills training? Weber identified these kinds of options as a retreat from the world, as a kind of know-nothing mysticism. What Weber did not consider were other forms of mysticism which are bound to reason. In the Catholicism specifically rejected by Weber, there is a long history of considering the relationship between reason and faith, of mediating an individual calling through a communal authority, and very different accounts of vocation result. In the Judaism Weber counseled against, there are too many ancient and modern accounts of the relationship between science, vocation, and faith to name. In the growing number of immigrant physicians within American medicine, there are alternative accounts of a physician Protestantism. Even within the Protestantism he counseled against, there are too many ancient and modern perhaps an alternative still exists. Osler preferred wisdom literature and the gospel to the letters of Paul, but within Equinomitas, he referenced St. Paul's noble Christian. Noble? Like a chivalrous knight? That same Paul wrote this to the Corinthians. Consider your own calling, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. Rather, God chose the foolish of the world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak of the world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised of the world, those who count for nothing, to reduce to nothing those who are something, so that no human being might boast before God. Physicians who read Paul and believe in something as foolish to the disenchanted world as an empty tomb, a different kind of box, might not pursue a noble calling or a rationalized vocation. They might become holy fools serving the indigent ill. Paul also had an interpretive box, and the Pauline box reduces the something of the physician's vocation into the nothing of being a servant using what the world regards as worthless remains to see and serve the weak, the lowly, the despised. Such physicians are called not from within to an Oslerian nobility, which elevates their profession, or to a Weberian rationality, which satisfies their search for knowledge. Such physicians are called first out of epistemic overconfidence, which privileges cognitive labor over all other kinds of labor. Aware of our embodiment, such physicians are also called second to work alongside, not above, the lowly and despised of the medical world. Third, such physicians are called to a humble vocation of service. Indeed, as we search through the rubble of the worthless remains of a physician's calling, I believe the last virtue of a physician is not nobility or rationality, but humility. Okay. Thank you for the chance to talk to you a little bit about some of the intellectual underpinnings of this book. Dr. Collier told me to try to finish in 40 minutes. So on my clock, it's 10:39, and I'd welcome some questions. I appreciate the chance to be a little provocative and talk to you a little bit about Osler and different kinds of Halloween monsters.
Thanks, Dr. Nussbaum. That's so great. I have so many questions and comments, but as is our tradition in the Wall Family Speaker Series, we try to privilege questions from learners, medical students, trainees, fellows. So if anyone in the audience wants to unmute themselves and ask Dr. Nussbaum a question or pose a comment, we would love to hear from you. And Dr. Nussbaum, maybe you could stop sharing your slides too, so then we can make sure to maybe just see everybody a little bit more fully. Does anybody have a question or comment? While people are thinking, I might just start with a question, Abraham. So I really it resonated with me your framing of even our pleasure seeking as like utilitarian. Like we only do it if it sort of serves us to be a better worker in this market of producing and consuming, and everything is towards this end of productivity. And so I just wonder how you wrestle against that, right? I mean, I think of like all the amazing things that you've done, right? You've written like all these books, but like also lovely, right? These books like add to your CV and probably have gotten you to be a full professor. So it's not just pursuing writing for the sake of writing, although maybe there's part of that there. Like it also is a means to the end of academic rank, right? So I just wonder how you make time or how you justify time that is for the pursuit of its own good and not towards like your CV building, which also has to be robust for you to be who you are. So can you comment on that for yourself?
Very kind of you to say. I don't know how robust my CV building is, right? I'm not at the University of Michigan, a storied place, right? If you read the Flexner report, the University of Michigan's called out as really one of the models even then. I guess I would say that I'm nobody's person to offer advice because I feel like I've done the academic pathway in an odd way, right? Every step of my life, I have thought about what I wanted to do, and then it hasn't worked out, and then it's surprised me at how much better it was than my plan.
Mm.
And I would honestly tell you, I'll be concrete for that since we have some students on the call, right? I thought I was moving here to become a schizophrenia researcher, right? That's what I had done in residency, and my schizophrenia research didn't work out. I've taken a series of jobs, and life has just sent me other places. I truly believe that you're right. Some of the things you do, like giving this talk or writing a book, help with your CV. But honestly, for me, it's mostly been things that I just get really interested in. I just start pulling at a thread. I like to read. And so in some ways, it's hard for me to be critical of cognitive labor because, in fact, that's what I'm good at, right? In the book, I reflect on the ways in which I'm lucky to be born at this time because my particular skills are privileged by medical school. I like to read things. But yeah, honestly, most of these things that I do that I'm privileged to do are things that I've just gotten interested in. And to me, but let me answer your question differently. The point that Weber makes about the use of time, I would say that is something I am very guilty of, right? And trying to think more seriously about leisure is something that I try to get better at. So I try very hard not to, I don't sign charts during what they call pajama time, except in really urgent situations. I try hard not to bring home work after 5 o'clock. And I have found that the biggest help for me has been that I'm incredibly grateful to have met the woman I married on the first day of med school. We became physicians together, and we had a kid during med school, which is not what the dean advised. It was not anybody's plan. And so part of why L.A. Paul's story about parents, vampires, and physicians resonates with me is that I became a physician as I became a parent. And for me, it has always pushed me to live in the world and time differently. So I'll work hard all day today. I woke up early and I'll do that. But at 5 o'clock, I'll be at a meeting for my daughter's middle school basketball team, and I'll be the coach for that. And I am not a good coach. Like, she is not going to go pro. She's the best. But Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese have nothing to fear from my daughter. I'm there because I want to be with her, because I want to hang out with 12-year-olds and help them become friends and become physically fit. And that is a different way of time, right? There's no CV benefit to being a middle school girls basketball coach. There's no, yeah. And so I guess I would say that some of those choices that you don't make, that you just have to live with, make that for you. That's, I think, one of the great things about the disability literature, right? Is that it just reminds you that some of these things aren't choices for people, that you have to live differently in time. The way that we think about living in time in this Weberian sense is the weird one. That's the outlier. If that makes any sense. I'm
That's
rambling.
helpful. No, that's super helpful. I just, for our students in the group, I just want to maybe highlight a few themes that came up there. One is this difference between doing and being, right? There's these two modes, right? And this doing and this being. How many times are we sort of doing, and how much time actually are we just being, and what's the beauty of that? And also you brought up this idea of sort of rest versus leisure. for students, Joseph Pieper, the philosopher, talks about rest and leisure actually are very different things. Like leisure we do, but oftentimes it's not the same as like a Sabbath or a rest. And I just think also the third theme here of like the tyranny of time, how much we contribute in the culture or subculture of medicine, the tyranny of time, and how that affects other people's sense of flourishing and the boundary of limits. Thank you. Anyone with any questions or comments opening up to the floor? You can just unmute yourself and chime in. Don't be shy. Angela, yeah.
I welcome it.
Yeah, Dr. Nussbaum, it's good to see you again. I'm wondering, just in your leadership at Denver Health, if there's any particular ways that you try to implement some of these like reflections into your leadership over learners and faculty.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for asking. I really appreciate it. Lots of ways, right? That's part of why I wrote this last book, was because it describes how I think we have to change the structures of life, right? It would be disingenuous if I said to you that the key thing is to do these kind of add-on activities. Let's do yoga for people, harried practitioners, stuff like that. Life hacks are good. I use a lot of them, but they don't change the fundamental question. I believe you have to change the structures. So part of why I wrote this last book is because I thought that the particular learning model that we implemented here is called the LIC, and we are longitudinal graded clerkships. And I think that it's a way that gets people back to relationship-based learning rather than just knowledge-based learning. And so I made an argument for it. And what was really cool was that in the course of writing this book, we went from a pilot project of 10 students to ultimately our entire medical school went this way. And so I really wanted to uphold that as a structure that would change that. There are lots of other practical ways that I do that. I see Adam's got a bicycle in the back, right? I bike commute. I find that's a different way to engage in time, different way of getting into space. And I can actually, because I'm a doctor, I can show you studies that you're a more committed citizen if you bike to work, weirdly, because you kind of see what the street looks like. And then I help residents and students bike to work too, right? We've created a bike garage, things like that. We give out, when I orient the new interns and residents, I talk to them about joining a community and how the importance of that is. I don't know how many of you are any of you Michigan basketball fans? Thank you. I'm a Carolina basketball fan, and in Chapel Hill, I went to med school in Chapel Hill, and in Chapel Hill, there's a restaurant named Time Out in honor of Chris Webber in the Carolina-Michigan game. And the longstanding coach of the Carolina Tar Heels was a guy named Dean Smith, and he would require all of his basketball players to join a religious community when they arrived on campus. He says, I don't care what religion you are, but you need to join some house of worship. That's a really amazing thing to say, and I don't know that you could say that today, but I will literally give out to all of our residents a list of different community organizations they can join. And I'll say, at least think about joining the library. Think about joining the Botanic Gardens. But if you can, think about getting more involved in the world. Because I think part of what people struggle with today is that they don't have a sense of belonging to a community besides the hospital or their individual friend groups. And so I guess we'll try to create structures for people to do that. I hope that helps.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Other thoughts or questions or comments?
Yeah,
Adam,
please.
yeah.
My fellow bicycle commuter.
That's right. So I wonder to what extent this is medicine specific and medical training specific, or if medical trainees are at like the tip of the iceberg. To what extent this is like the Robert Putnam bowling alone phenomenon, that kind of the structures that we existed in have fallen apart, and not only have those structures fallen apart, but in addition to like a sense of nihilism, perhaps there's a sense of like the coming apocalypse, whether that's like climate change or every election feels apocalyptic, that there's warnings about what will happen if one candidate wins or the other candidate wins. And that individuals who are kind of going through medical training, kind of like the practice of medicine is about caring for the one person in front of you. It's an iterative process of looking at the one person in front of you. Maybe there's questions of like, what's the meaning of caring for one person in front of me if like the whole world's about to catch on fire and hurricanes are about to destroy everything, and like what kind of a obsession with the limitations of our behaviors or actions or efforts.
I have good news. I don't think Michigan is in danger from hurricanes. I think you're safe up there. But your broader point is fair. You asked a couple different things there. Putnam's work's really interesting, right? Bowling alone, but the way he talks about bridging and bonding, social capital, all interesting. I've started explicitly teaching that to students. So one of my roles is that I teach the basic sciences for underlying psychiatry. And that gives me an opportunity to talk about those things. So I'll specifically teach that to students and then try to give them examples of that. I think that you're right. Some of this is the broader question of a culture. Every culture gets the medicine it deserves, and this is the medicine we deserve, right? I do think it's especially acute in certain ways for medical trainees, because unlike most people, they're really encouraged to move around the country and the world, right? It's very rare for a young person to say, I grew up in this town, I did all my training here and stayed here. That's very rare. Instead, they're really encouraged to move around the country. There's great opportunities of that. You learn amazing things. There's experts at each of these academic medical centers who are remarkable. But if you're going to pursue it as a young person, you really need to think intentionally about how you're going to have a community outside of academic medicine. And one way to think about this is that, question of like, what do you want your tombstone to say? Mine is, on my worst day, I think mine's going to say he answered all his emails, right? And my guess is that no one's going to put my PubMed index score on my tombstone, whatever tombstones look like in the future. I don't think anybody's going to care. I think people are going to care about these other things. And if that's true, which Putnam says and other people do too, then that's where you ought to build your life today, right? And that is, I think, a real challenge for medical trainees because they are encouraged. They're told, go to the best place for fellowship, for residency, for med school. So I think that's a challenge. With regards to this kind of sense of the world being in the worst possible way, I understand that. I feel that way sometimes too. Spending time on Twitter or reading the newspaper, you can feel that way. I guess I would just say that that's, to me, one of the great advantages of reading history is that seems unlikely, right? Today's Indigenous Peoples Day, right? If you think about those moments, or you think about 1939 Germany, or other times in history, 1820s Mississippi, this time does not feel as bad as that to me. And so I think reading history is really helpful to remind us that there is some context for these things. We have particular challenges today, but we also have particular opportunities. So that'd be my argument is that what we need to do is help our trainees say, your membership is not fundamentally in the academic medical center. You have a people that grew you up, and you need to be rooted in those people, whatever they are, above and beyond the academic medical center. Your life is not the academic medical centers. Sorry, with all due respect to the academic medical centers.
It's a good reminder for all of us. We don't hear that counter message a ton.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Just feel free to unmute.
Hi, Dr. Nussbaum. My name is Diana. Thank you so much for the talk and all of the wisdom you're providing. I do plan on looking into your book, but I'm just a little bit more curious. I'm curious to hear more about the relationship based medical training that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. Thanks so much, Diana. Thanks so much for being here. Where are you at in your training?
I'm actually still a pre-med student.
Great.
I'm doing a master's program right now in physiology. I graduated from undergrad and then we'll be applying to medical school.
Congratulations. It gets better at every stage. I really believe that. You have more agency at every stage, whether you realize it or not. At every stage of this journey, you have more agency. So Kristen and I have some mutual friends, and one of them invited me out to give a talk at a big fancy university, Ivy League school. And I went out there, and I always like to meet with med students. I'm happy to do Zoom, but I prefer to meet with people in person. It's just a different kind of encounter. And I've learned to ask the med students, how much time do you spend with the faculty? Do you know a faculty member, right? And what I've learned is that at most med schools, the med students will say something like, yeah, I see them all the time. And I'll say, what do you mean? They'll say, they come on rounds and I see them on rounds and then they're gone. And I'll be like, how many days do they spend on rounds with you? And they'll be like, maybe a week. And then the faculty have other things to do. And then I'm left with a resident or junior resident. And I said, is there a faculty member you could text today, call today, and would know something about you appropriately, nothing inappropriate? And most of them will say no. That breaks my heart. Because the good news about Osler's system, the really good news about Osler's system is that it was social, right? There were a ton of people in the hospital. Even when I trained, I was the first class where duty hours were being phased out. The hospitals were crowded at night. There were lots of us. Duty hours working, when we started, we were Q3, Q4, or even as a psychiatrist for all of the first year. We worked so hard, but there were lots of people there. And today, most residents have more circumscribed hours, but a lot of shift work, and they do a lot of night float, and they're often alone on night float. And they don't have the continuity with the patients, with their peers, with the faculty. So part of what I was intrigued about with the LIC was that it said to students, instead of doing serial apprenticeships with lots of different people in the hospital, you would go to one clinical site and you'd spend your entire clinical year there, and you would have a cohort of patients. And wherever the patients would go, you would follow. And the goal, what I like about that is this idea that a physician learns that his or her alliance is with the patients, not with the physicians, and they would see the same patients in different clinical settings. So you're the same person wherever you are, but you're going to behave differently and be differently in an operating room, emergency department, a clinic, a psychiatric setting, but the same medical student would follow those patients there. Then when they did didactics, they had a small group of faculty who were really not necessarily skilled at being research scientists, which is the Oslerian model of who should teach, but they were really good teachers. And they would do problem-based learning. And so 10 students would gather in a room every Thursday afternoon for 4 hours, and they'd work through cases together. And one of the things that you saw is that they brought each other snacks. And I don't know about you, but I've never been a part of any culture anywhere in the world where people don't relate to each other through food, right? It's a common way of doing so. And you could see the students showing care for each other, of being like, so in the book I wrote about, like, one of them got engaged and they brought like gummy bears, which is not usually what you think of as an engagement snack, right? But they stopped by the hospital cafe because they wanted to engage their peers. And you can think about that as a sign of a relational culture when people bring food for each other. Does that make sense? And so I believe that that's one way back for us, is to think about structures that still teach people a ton and still are demanding, but that they're relational based, that they would know their faculty and know each other. People deserve friends along the way throughout this.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. We have time probably for one more question or comment. Anyone else has something that they want to add or say?
Hello, thank you so much for your talk today. I kind of, building on that most recent question, had a question regarding, I'm a current med student, kind of just about to start residency interviews, and intern year is kind of billed as this very impending, slightly threatening, beautiful, challenging thing that will be very immersive. And I think just trying to kind of reconcile that with also my values and goals, and then also trying to understand what culture is like, and what to look for as I start chatting with different programs and navigating this. So I'd really love your kind of take or perspective or advice for somebody at this juncture.
Thanks so much. I can't see you just because of Zoom, so I don't know your name, but I'll say I'm so glad you're becoming a physician, and I wish you a flourishing match, right? Not just a high match. And approach it that way. Don't ask yourself, hey, where's the place that has the most NIH funding? That matters, but what really matters is the question about how flourishing they are. So find out questions like, how many people finish the program? One of the questions I like to ask is, what percentage of the residents have a dependent, right? What percentage, if it's important to you to be able to live close to the hospital, what percentages of residents are able to afford to rent or buy close to the hospital? Ask them for what kind of events they have that are retreats or things that people go to and socialize. Ask about their social calendar and see if it's a social calendar that's agreeable to you. Colorado's social calendar, I love it. I'm an outdoors person, just like other Colorado people, but it's not for everybody. It tends to be a little broy and a little focused on going outdoors, right? Think about if there's something you can do. If you can, visit the place and try to walk around and see what people look like, if they talk to each other or if their faces are buried in their phones. try to figure out map out what your day would look like in that place and say, would I enjoy the walk or drive or bus ride to work? Is there a place that I could go outdoors and have my attention reframed? Think about that question. Think about some of those questions. And then also on some level, you do need to enter into it as a transformative experience that really is going to change you. And it is going to be hard work. And think about, is it going to be the kind of transformative experience? I'll sometimes use a different metaphor of athletics. Is it the kind of thing that's going to build me up and be a good coach? Or is it going to be a bad coach that's going to tear me down? You don't need that. You don't need somebody who's going to tear you down and denigrate you, beat you up, right? You need a coach who's going to say, you're going to be a better version of yourself. You're going to be able to do things you couldn't do. So I apologize. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
That's super helpful. Well, Dr. Nussbaum, thank you. I really appreciate, again, I agree with Diana, you have wisdom to share. And really a great mix today of like medical history and also this really practical ending that we've had about ways that you've incorporated relationality into the practice that you have and how you help other people see the same in their lives and vocations as physicians. So thank you so much for attending. Friends, sadly, we've come to the end of our time together. I just put a couple links into the chat about things I mentioned at our opening. Dr. Nussbaum's talk will be up on our YouTube channel. Please reach out to me or Adam or any of our colleagues for any assistance or conversations you want to have in follow-up from today. We're so happy that you've been part of our time today together. Bye, friends. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Abraham.
Thank you.